Senator, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the vote last week on the national emergency. You're one of a dozen Republicans that voted to basically overturn the president's decision to declare it a national emergency. Why?
Well, I actually am in favor of a national emergency. I'm in favor of a wall. And the president has enough money between what Congress appropriated this year, $1.3 billion, the $800 million or so that it's in the forfeiture fund, which is money we take from criminals, El Chapo, whoever, and then also about over $4 billion in a special Department of Defense fund designed for counter-drug. So you take those three together, I have no problem with an emergency declaration that uses that money to fund the wall. The problem is the last fund that they accessed, and that is the military construction fund. The problem with the military construction fund is that that is a fund that Congress has specifically appropriated for the construction of military facilities. And the Constitution says that Congress is the only one that can appropriate. And so if we create a precedent, as we did here, that a president can declare an emergency and take funds that were specifically appropriated by Congress for one purpose and use it for something else, that precedent, once set, will be used by future presidents, perhaps for policy outcomes that I don't support. But either way, infringes on the constitutional separation of powers. And it was unnecessary in this case, too, because there's plenty of money from the other funds. So that was the reason why.
So the Defense Department put out a list this week talking about some of the vulnerable areas that could be tapped into under that defense appropriation that you were referring to. Key West is slated to get about $128 million. Naval Air Station Mayport in Jacksonville has $150 million in unused funds. Elgin Air Force Base has about more than $220 million that's been designated to be used for construction-related projects. All of these are now vulnerable, as well as other projects, Patrick Air Force Base, a number of others. Do you believe that these funds are now going to be tapped into?
Well, the administration has said they'll backfill it, right? They're going to come in next year and offer more money to make up the difference. So that's, at this point, now that it's in place, because the veto is not going to be overturned, the question now becomes, can we get the money to backfill it? But the bigger issue wasn't just the money, it was the constitutional precedent that this sets.
So why did the president push it? If the money is, your argument is constitutionally it's questionable, but more importantly, practically it wasn't necessary because there were other pots of money to draw from.
Well, yeah.
So then why did the president push this? Was this just politics?
No, I had the same conversation with him, including on the day of the vote, and I said, we don't need to do this. It creates a precedent. And I think their view is they want the flexibility, because if you count that fund, they can have up to $8 billion for construction. And I think they wanted the flexibility so they wouldn't have to use all the money from the first two funds. So again, I just think it sets a problematic precedent, because now in the future, if in fact any president can just decide, I don't care what Congress designed the money for, I'm going to come back and use it for something different, then what's the point of even having Congress or a budget? And let me add one more point in this regard. I've opposed overreaches in the past. When Obama did it, I've opposed overreaches constitutionally. There have been plenty of emergencies declared throughout our history. There's about 30 of them that are still active. And if the president had said, I'm going to take the military construction money, and instead of spending it in Eglin, I'm going to spend it overseas because we need a base over there, that's within his constitutional power. But to take it from military base construction and use it for something else is a precedent that is going to be used in the future by a president with whom I do not agree with, to do things counter to this. For example, a future president could say, I don't care if you gave $1 billion for the wall, I'm going to use it for something else. That could be the counter reaction to this, and it's going to be a problem.
The president's budget is asking for another $8 billion for the wall. Do you support that?
Sure. I don't know. It's not $8 billion for the wall. It's $8 billion for border security. Part of that is a wall, and we do need physical structures. And it's not me saying it. It's not the president saying it. The experts have told us if we don't have physical structures, we cannot funnel traffic into areas that we can monitor. The other point to make here is this is a crisis, and I'll tell you what the crisis of it. It's a humanitarian crisis. While the sheer numbers or volumes of crossings are not up, the number of children and families crossing the border is through the roof. And we have now people basically trafficking in children. The cases are there, they are clear, they are documented, of people that are showing up with children that they're not related to because they believe and they know that it gives them a privileged status to enter the country. We have got to create disincentives to that. It is a dangerous journey. No one should undertake that journey. If people want to apply for asylum, they should have an opportunity to do so from their home country or a third country. But to entice people to take that journey is inviting them to put themselves in the hands of some of the worst human beings on the planet, these coyotes, these human traffickers.
Not far from where we sit right now is a detention center for children. The Homestead place where you have children who have been separated from the adults they came across the border with are being housed there. About 1,500 or so kids, maybe a little bit more there. Is that a shame? Should we be ashamed that a facility like that exists in our own backyard?
But perhaps not for the reasons that you're asking or others may intimate. It is unfortunate that people live in countries that they fear so deeply that they put their kids on this dangerous journey to come to the United States. The bottom line is what was happening is people were showing up at the border with children. If our policy was we're not going to divide families and you couldn't house the parents and not the kids, they were just releasing everybody. And then people, when they were supposed to show up in 3 years for their hearing, never showed up.
Yeah, but
and so it became an incentive for more people to make that journey.
The incident of parents not showing up became far less. There was good tracking devices. There was monitoring that was making that far less of a problem. Far more were actually showing up than not.
The substantial number of people that were not showing up to their appointments were well over 35–40% of the cases. Some were taking off the ankle bracelets and lost into the general population 2 or 3 years from now. The bigger point is the word spread. The word spread in Honduras. I understand why people are leaving these countries, but we are enticing them to make this dangerous journey because the word spread that if you show up at the border with children, you'll be processed, you'll be released, you won't have to show up for 3 years, and by then who knows what could happen. And word got back and more people were taking this journey. And now we have a situation that is unsustainable. No country in the world can sustain that number of people showing up, especially with children, at a border. It's just not humane, and we can't do it.
Let's stay with the budget for a second. Florida had wanted $200 million as part of the federal budget for Everglades restoration and related projects. The Trump budget only allotted about $63 million. I know that you, Governor DeSantis, Senator Scott, others in the delegation all came out with a very strong statement saying that you were disappointed and a little put off, I would say, by the numbers put in there by the president. Did the president betray Florida by not putting the money in?
No, I think what happens is they come up with this budget and they want to get under a spending limit. And so in order to prioritize some things, you got to make other budget line items less. I have a long list of projects, including the democracy program in Cuba, that have been cut. It doesn't mean that's where it's going to wind up. The problem with it is that under the earmarks rules that we now have, that's the ceiling. That's as high as we can go. So the only way we can supplement that 60, there's two things that need to happen. Ideally, the White House would amend their budget request and increase that number a little higher, maybe not the full $200 million, which we need, but higher. And then second is we can do something called additional funding for approved projects. That wouldn't be specifically delineated for the Everglades, but if we can get that number of additional funding high enough, a percentage of that will be for the Everglades and could get us close to or at the $200 million.
But wasn't this the argument that Rick Scott made in running for the Senate and that DeSantis made in running for governor, that they have this close relationship with the president and they'll be able to help bring home these sort of dollars, exactly this sort of funding for the Everglades because of their relationship to the president? It does seem as if the president turned his back on them.
Well, that's not the budget. In essence, that's not what's going to be funded. That is the president's proposed budget. Now the work of Congress, which has, as we discussed constitutionally, the power to appropriate, now it's up for Congress to step forward, make that happen, ensure we have the support of the administration to do two things: increase the number from 60 to something higher, but more importantly, openly advocate and push. Because if we turn over this money, it's not earmarked to the Army Corps of Engineers. Let's say we turn over 300, the number's 300. They then decide how much of that to apportion to different places. We want to see a significant percentage of that added on to the 60 or 70 billion so that we get to the full 200 that we need to get this moving forward. So the work now begins. We're going to get, we're going to work real hard at the appropriations level in both the House and Senate. And I believe, and the White House has already expressed a willingness to work with us to get that number higher.
But if the president disappointed on the funding for Everglades restoration, another promise that was made during the campaign season was to guarantee there be no offshore oil drilling in Florida, off the Atlantic coast or off the Gulf Coast. The president is going to be announcing soon his plans as it relates to offshore oil drilling. Are you confident that he will come back with a plan that does not include offshore oil drilling in Florida, or are you concerned that there may be in there?
I'm vigilant, obviously, because the Department of Interior and others weigh in on this situation, and I know that Senator Scott's involved in these conversations, and we are in the House delegation. It's a pretty strong consensus in our delegation that we don't want, in Florida, including House and Senate members, Republicans and Democrats, that we want this the current limitations to be extended for a significant period of time. I have a bill that does it, and I should say we're vigilant, but I'm confident that at the end of this process, that consensus will be respected.
But you're not confident that the president will say it in the coming weeks?
No, I am. I'm just vigilant, obviously, because, again, when it gets down to that level, I mean, the notion that the president is personally involved in drawing that up, I mean, the agency, Interior is going to play a big role in making that decision. So we will interact with the White House to make sure the word gets down that they don't want to see this at the front. I'd rather win that battle at the front end than at the back end, but we'll win it.
Oil drilling in the Everglades, that's suddenly come up. Where do you stand on whether or not we should be drilling for oil in the Everglades?
Look, there's existing exploration rights that people may have legal rights to do, and the courts will decide that. I don't know what the status of that court case is at this moment. There was some talk today that there might have been a mistake in the court ruling, somebody said. But that said, that the court actually said it was a mistaken ruling. But by and large, I'd prefer it not. And I think that to the extent that there aren't existing leases there now, new ones should be scrutinized and perhaps not even necessary at this point. And if it in any way impedes the restoration work that we're working on, then I would be opposed to it. I am against anything that slows down Everglades restoration. We've begun to gain momentum. We got to finish it. We've got to do it now. We cannot afford a 1 or 2 year lull or any projects that get in the way of it.
Staying with the environment for a section, the president also wants to cut funding for the EPA by more than 30%. His new pick to be the EPA administrator, Andrew Wheeler, has been cutting back on regulations, going to continue to cut back on regulations. Andrew Wheeler was a former coal lobbyist. Was he a good choice for EPA secretary?
I think Andrew will do a good job, and I don't think the fact that you worked for an industry makes it impossible for you to be fair in the decisions that you make. Just because you're reducing regulations doesn't mean you're doing harm to the environment. It depends which ones you're eliminating. Over time, these regulations begin to stack up. Some do not make sense. Some do not have a cost-benefit analysis that justify them. But I think all of us, I would hope, share the goal of having clean water and clean air and dealing with anything. Look, in Florida, the water issues are our #1 state issue. They're economic. They're not just environmental. We've seen the impact of blue-green algae. We've seen red tide. We've seen the debates we're having now about releases from Lake Okeechobee and the management of that water and what it can mean to the future if there is an overabundance of water that has to be released during the middle of the summer when there's algae in Lake Okeechobee. So my view of it is it depends on, I think you can reduce a significant amount of the regulatory burden without harming the environment, so long as you're reducing the right ones and not ones that actually make a difference.
Do you think cutting the budget by 30% is a good idea?
Well, again, I'd have to see the details of the agency's budget, but I think all federal agencies, for the most part, could afford a diet in terms of how much they're spending.
One of the issues you're going to be dealing with is the new free trade agreement between the United States and Canada and Mexico. I know that last time we talked late last year, you were disappointed in some of the finer points of the deal, and you did not believe that Florida farmers came out well in the deal. Has it been modified? Are you still likely to vote? I mean, you seem to be leaning against the deal without coming out against it.
But what's happened since then is we've worked with the administration and Ambassador Lighthizer, and they have now instituted an investigation on unfair trade practices, which was a holdup. They didn't want to do it. They thought it endangered the deal, but they are finally doing that investigation. There is no doubt that when that investigation is concluded, it will find that Florida growers are being dumped on, are being harmed by Mexican growers who are flooding the U.S. market with cheaper goods and knocking our folks out of business. And I'm going to tell you, if they knock out our growers like in South Dade, that land will never go back to agriculture. It will be developed, and we will never get it back. And we cannot lose our agricultural capacity. It's a key part of our state's economy.
So is the fact that that investigation is ongoing mean that you'll be voting for the NAFTA agreement, or do you have to wait to see the results?
Right, of course. But I'm confident of the results. But we want to see results. And the timeline, I should say, of that investigation should be in before there's any vote on this.
Okay. But as it stands now, you would not vote for the NAFTA agreement?
I will say this. I have my skepticism and my opposition to a deal that harms Florida growers has been pretty well expressed. I'm not here to deliver ultimatums. I think we're going to get a positive outcome from the investigation. I think there's a legal change in the law we want to make that allow our growers. It's complicated, but they themselves cannot bring complaints because it's got to be over 50% of the industry, and the California growers are growing.
It's not
in
about
Mexico.
Dollars. It's not about subsidies or anything like that.
No.
It's more of an enforcement mechanism.
Right. The Mexicans are flooding our market with cheap tomatoes and vegetables and knocking our guys out of business. We'll lose our agricultural capacity. So I'm not making any ultimatums about the trade deal because by and large, I think having a trade deal with Mexico and Canada is good. But I will have a hard time supporting any deal that does not create fairness for our growers here in Florida.
Let's turn to Venezuela. The president, we're typing this on Tuesday, the president held a press conference earlier today where he said that he has not lost confidence in the ability to unseat Maduro and that they haven't done some of the toughest sanctions yet. Are you worried, though, that the momentum seems to have been lost in the move to oust Maduro?
No, on the contrary. I think the momentum's only increasing, but perhaps in ways that aren't publicly visible. As an example, The only cash buyer that Venezuela, the regime has to generate cash for oil is India, a company named Reliant. And this administration pressured India, and we reached out to the embassy and talked to leaders. And late last week, Reliant, an Indian company, announced we are not buying any more oil from Venezuela until sanctions against them are lifted by the U.S. They've just basically lost their only cash buyer. The oil they give Russia, China, and Cuba is, in the case of Russia and China, it's to pay off debt. They don't get any money for it. The oil they give Cuba is in exchange for intelligence experts and other, repressive tactics that the Cubans are providing them with. So you look at, and by the way, the sanctions that were imposed in January had a 30 to 60-day grace period, but the regime is running out of hard currency that they use to buy the loyalty, quote unquote, of those who hold Maduro in place. The impact is only beginning to bite.
There's an argument that is often made that says that by the U.S. embracing so strongly to Guaido, that in fact it weakens Guaido because it can be seen as a puppet of the United States, which can strengthen Maduro's hand inside Venezuela.
Yeah, but that assumes that there's this strong anti-American sentiment in Venezuela, which is just not accurate. I mean, Venezuela is a Western country. Plenty of people in Venezuela have family living in the U.S. We're ascribing Middle Eastern attributes to a Western country in the Western Hemisphere. That's the argument the Maduro regime people use, but it's not realistic. And number two, Juan Guaido is the interim president. He's already announced he's not even running for president. He is the president of the National Assembly, whose job it is to assume the presidency in a vacancy and transition the country to a free and fair election that would elect somebody else. That's what we're supporting. We're supporting him and the institutions and the Constitution of Venezuela, and the Venezuelans' people desire to transition peacefully to democracy.
I want to give you a chance to respond to something. You've been criticized for some of the retweets and tweeting that you've done on the issue of Venezuela. People believe that you've been retweeting some unverified information. For instance, the issue with regard to the Molotov cocktail that went into and burned one of the supply trucks that was trying to get into Venezuela. The New York Times did an analysis, believed that it was not the Maduro regime which set the fire to it, but it was an errant Molotov cocktail thrown by protesters of the regime. Does it concern you at all what you retweet?
No. I mean, yeah, I don't retweet things that are not verified. The New York Times don't know what they're talking about. They analyzed 30 seconds of a video. You know who I relied on? The people who were there and the Colombian government. The Colombian government says it was them, and they had border agents there. New York Times is watching some video, 30 seconds of a much longer video. And by the way, the New York Times didn't say that they know that that wasn't. They just said that there's indications it may not have been. The other one was a retweet of an independent media outlet inside of Venezuela that the Miami Herald, who criticized me, has cited for what a great job they're doing. So these are I honestly, people can write whatever they want. I'm not into the whole attack the media thing. But Maduro says that the U.S. knocked out electricity by sending drones that conducted an electromagnetic attack. That's crazy. That's the things they should be focused on. But if they want to write about the tweets, they can.
60 Minutes on Sunday had a really interesting story as it relates to the victims in Cuba at the embassy there, and linking them to an instance in China in which 15 State Department officials in China at embassies or consulates have also been affected and are showing very similar symptoms. I know this has been an issue that you've been very closely monitoring. Do you believe that the victims at the State Department level in China are been subject to the same type of ray or whatever sound machine or whatever it is as was affecting those in Cuba?
Well, and by the way, not just the U.S. people in Cuba, but the Canadians have also had a number of people with the same instance happen. The State Department's already said that 2 of them are consistent with what's happening with what they call the Havana cohort. There are others that they have questions about. I'm not going to get into what the doctors are determining or the like. My view of it, though, is that if you have similar symptoms happening in a place like that, we should be fair to these people. They were certainly injured while they were over there. And we'll press the State Department. And we'll have more to say in the weeks to come as we're pressing the State Department for more information on how even the Cuba incidents were handled in the early days. There is some indication that there was an effort to sort of diminish what was happening late in the last administration, early in this one, by some at the State Department because they feared that disclosure of these attacks would undermine the diplomatic opening to Cuba. People can feel any way they want about that opening and the changes that President Obama made, but we have a duty to protect our men and women that we send abroad in our diplomatic corps. And if anyone at the State Department tried to diminish it or in any way kind of cover it to protect a broader policy initiative, we're going to have a big problem with them.
I want to pause for a second. I just want you to wipe your lip like that. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to pick up right where you left off because that takes me nicely to the next question. And I know we're short on time, but the argument is now being made that that's exactly what the State Department is doing with regard to China, that there's an effort to downplay the incidents in China for fear of knocking off the trade talks and the U.S. relationship to China.
Well, again, if that's the case, then somebody should be held accountable for it. We're concerned about that. I share the same concerns that were highlighted in that report. My colleague Jean Shaheen from New Hampshire has already written letters about this. I've spoken to her and her staff about it as well. We are concerned. We think that clearly if you have people harmed in a certain way in Havana and then the same thing happened in another country with a similar style government and similar intelligence practices, there's strong evidence to indicate that there's linkage there. That's my view. Obviously, I don't know every individual case. But that said, we will most certainly be asking and have been asking tough questions of the State Department. By the way, a lot of these decisions we've made at the bureaucratic level. There are a lot of people that have been in the State Department for 25 or 30 years that have nothing to do with this administration, who conduct a lot of our foreign policy at the ground level. And we're going to be looking at how every one of them behaved. And if there's any wrongdoing, any type of covering up because they don't want to impact foreign policy somewhere else, we won't tolerate it. We'll hold them accountable. We'll name them. And we'll make sure that they're held accountable.
There was also part of that 60 Minutes piece talked about a case going back into the 90s even of showing the same sort of technology potentially being used against a U.S. official from a country other than Cuba or China. It was kind of vague.
Yeah, we're aware of that case, and obviously some of that it remains classified, and so we won't discuss all the details of anything. Suffice it to say is I remain convinced that the Cuban government either did it or knows who did it.
Whose technology, though, is it? Do you believe
a nation state, without a doubt.
So, but do you believe it's Cuba? Do you believe it's Russia, China?
I think before you make that accusation, you have to have proof. But here's the bottom line. There is no way that this stuff doesn't happen by accident. There's no way that you can conduct attacks against American diplomats in one of the most carefully monitored cities in the world, against one of the most carefully monitored diplomats in the world, American, without the Cubans either being involved in it or allowing someone else to do it.
All right. Let me do a couple of things, and I just want to go back to the issue. The president's budget also calls for cutting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Does that concern you?
Yeah, again, I think there's a lot of, first of all, you can't cut Social Security. It's an entitlement program. It's built into the baseline budgeting. So they must be talking about I don't know if they're talking about the disability portion of it.
They are.
And, well, look, let me tell you, on disability, there needs to be reforms. We've all said this for a long time. It has become, there are people that are legitimately disabled and they deserve benefits, and there are people that are gaming the system. This has been documented. You hire a lawyer who can find the right disability judge, and they're granting disabilities to people sometimes for extended periods of time that are not justified by medical findings. That needs to be cut back on because that is hurting the people who actually deserve disability. And on the issue of Medicare and Medicaid, the cuts to Medicaid are not cuts. They are a reduction in the increase because we continue to push for empowering states to have more flexibility in how they implement that program. I do have some concerns about the Medicare reductions, but again, the president's budget is not, on those programs, because of the entitlement nature of Medicare, is not going to decide what the final program looks like. Every year we go through the same exercise at the state level as well. Governors come out with a budget, legislature passes something very different. That happens quite often because as we started this program, the power of appropriation belongs in our Constitution to the Congress, to the legislative branch.
Last month, the Senate held a hearing. I don't believe you were on the committee that dealt with prescription drugs. They had the CEOs and heads of 7 of the largest prescription drug manufacturers, before the Senate committee, and the senators just sort of beat up on them, one question after another. And it's clear the profits are huge. Everyone sort of agreed to it, but there seems to be no real clear plan in place to fix it. Everyone acknowledges it's a problem. Everyone knows some of the solutions. Why haven't we seen prescription drug reform?
Well, a couple, because it's not easy to solve. The first ugly truth is we are subsidizing the world. When you ask them, why does this medicine cost $100 in America and $2 somewhere else? The answer is because $2 is the only thing the government-run program in that country agrees to pay. So we're paying the difference. We have to confront it. One of the arguments people make is import drugs, which sounds like an easy answer, so long as you can confirm that what you're actually getting is what the medicine says it is. You have to make sure that those countries you're importing from have a system of production and a chain of custody that doesn't we don't wind up in a situation where Americans are taking medicines that are not what they say they are. Because
what about just being able to buy in bulk? Giving the federal government greater latitude. I think the VA is allowed to buy in bulk. I think certain other programs are allowed to buy in bulk.
Everybody is except the federal government because of the fear that it would lead to price fixing. I think all these things should be on the table and examined. But the other problem that's happening in pharmaceuticals is you have drugs that have been on the market for a long time, they're off patent, and they're now increasing prices. The most dramatic was the EpiPen just a couple of years ago. And they basically agreed, this is profiteering. I mean, yeah, we're charging it because we can get away with it. The whole thing needs to be looked at holistically. It's going to become a growing problem because an increasing amount of our medical care in this country is gravitating towards pharmaceuticals and away from procedures. And so it is something that I think a lot of options need to be on the table. And I'm open to anything that will solve this problem without cutting back on investment and without cutting back on innovation.
Very quick lightning round on a couple of things. Daylight savings time. Should we stop moving the clock front and back?
Well, it was my bill last year. I was ahead of my time, no pun intended. And absolutely, it makes no sense to continue to move back and forth. Frankly, I don't personally care which one of them it is. I like the one we're on now. But this moving back and forth makes no sense. It never really did. It makes less sense than ever.
Unless you're getting up in the morning and you need some extra sun.
Farmers aren't asking for this. So I don't know. It's not the most important issue confronting the Republic, but it's something we should do. The president supports it. We've got good bipartisan support. We've got some momentum on it. We'll see what happens.
The move to sort of do away with the Electoral College. I saw you sort of spoke about this recently.
Yeah.
Some Democrats are talking about getting rid of the Electoral College. It's not going to happen.
Well, but it's also not a good idea because the one thing the Electoral College does is it requires somebody running for president to campaign across various parts of the country. Otherwise, you'll just have people campaigning in 4 states, and you'll have sectionalism and regional presidencies. And frankly, there are interests in the Midwest, as an example, where there are not a lot of people, but a lot of the food we eat is grown there. And so those interests, in terms of having the variety and the distinction of our country, just because a place doesn't have a lot of people, doesn't mean that what happens in that state is not important to the health of our country.
Does it feel inherently wrong, though, that whether you're a Democrat or Republican, does it feel inherently wrong that you can win the majority of the vote and still lose the Electoral College?
But that, frankly, is rare.
But it's becoming more commonplace.
Well, it's happened twice in the last. It's happened in 2016 and 2000. And before that, it happened 3 or 4 times in the previous centuries. This is not like it's happening every other election. It is possible, but it is not common. It would happen in 2000 by a narrow margin, and then it happened again in 2016. And in between, we had multiple elections in which that was not the case.
All right. Let me ask you just real quick. You've run for president, so you know what this process is like. First off, are you sort of sit back and as you watch the field of crowded Democrats sort of go in, sort of like smile to yourself and just sort of say, yeah, I know what that's like. I feel good right now.
Yeah, part of it is obviously it's a lot of work. It can be very rewarding. But I think the most dramatic thing to watch is somebody's been out there in the public eye for years. You hardly heard anything about them. They launch, and all of a sudden it's 2 weeks of a string of stories about all the terrible things they've ever done. And people think this is great investigative reporting. Sometimes it is. A lot of time it's one of the other campaigns has packaged all this and is handing it to reporters.
Do you think Amy Klobuchar got a bad rap with the? It sounds almost like you're referring to like the Amy Klobuchar story.
I don't know. We can talk. I like Amy Klobuchar. We get along. We work well together. I don't know anything about her office or any of the details. But my point is that stuff, somebody had it. They were waiting. And so Democrats go around saying, we're not going to attack each other. But their operatives are out there feeding stories to the media about each other. And that's been happening forever, and that's never going to change.
So what's your take overall on the Democratic field?
I don't have a take. I don't even know who's all in. It's just so many different people. I don't even know how they're going to fit on a stage or do their debates. But ultimately, I think the president's in a very strong position to be reelected, especially as the Democratic Party has moved well outside the mainstream and is getting a lot of pressure to continue to move left.
Explain Beto to me. As you look at Beto from the distance.
Oh, Beto.
Beto,
yeah.
Right. Explain Beto to me.
I don't know anything about him. I've never met him. I didn't work with him in Congress. He was only there for a short period of time. I know he ran against Ted Cruz,
but you see that he raised $6.1 million in the first 24 hours. He's got the cover of Vanity Fair. You sort of look at this as you look back. How do you explain that?
Sometimes, a candidate gets into a race, grabs a narrative for a while. We saw Obama benefit from that and others. The key is sustaining it. Even as he's doing all that, you now are seeing critical stories emerge about him, and that's. I think David Axelrod, who's somebody I don't agree with politically, but someone who has some political acumen that's obviously been proven at the national level, has said it's like an MRI of the soul. When you run for president, you're going to be put through a trial by fire. You're going to be attacked by your opponents, by the media, and by others. And being able to sustain that momentum throughout a campaign, we had multiple front runners, Carly Fiorina, Ben Carson, Scott Walker before that, and ultimately the winner was Donald Trump. So candidates surge and ebb And in the end, but it's happened forever.
Who in the field should the president be most afraid of?
I'm not sure about the answer to that. I don't really think there's anybody in that field right now that beats him. I really don't. But, we'll see. There'll be an election. We'll find out. But I think
Biden's
he
not
wins.
in that field yet. Would you put Biden in that category?
No,
that won't
he's
be
run
able to
for
beat him?
president before, and it hasn't worked out. Joe Biden's a nice guy. I don't agree with him politically, but I'm not sure that he is going to be able to, even if he wanted to, separate himself from the radical elements that continue to push the Democratic Party away from things that Joe Biden has long supported. I mean, this is a party that has long supported, many of them, we have them on record, on video, saying they support a wall, support immigration enforcement, and now won't even fund a quarter of what they've approved in the past because it's President Trump that wants it. So I think, frankly, I don't know how he or any of them escaped the gravity of that left-of-center pull, radical left-of-center pull that's currently acting on the party.
Senator, thank you very much for your
Thanks.
time.
Thank you.